Headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
I mentioned there that the main headlines, vulnerable groups, over 75s, etc. How important is the booster?
This group of individuals, 5 million of them, they're the ones that were written to by the government to say you are vulnerable, you need to shield during COVID, and now they're being focused on and advised to seek an additional booster dose. This would take the total dosage of vaccines in these people to 4. The rationale behind this, which the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation are at pains to emphasise, is not because they've got documented evidence that these people are seeing a drop in immunity or that they're at even higher risk now. It is as a cautionary measure. And the reason it's a cautionary measure is these very same people were prioritised to get their first vaccines and get boosted first. So the greatest time has elapsed since then. And since we know that everyone's immunity does slip a bit with time, at least detectable immunity, and immunity against infection is different from immunity against severe disease, they are taking the cautionary step while levels are still very high in the community, because we have got perhaps 1 person in 20 currently infected and therefore capable of passing on the infection. They're taking this as a cautionary measure to protect those people, top up their immunity, and that buys us a bit more time to get us into summer, when we anticipate that the levels will be a lot lower anyway, and then even though everyone else's immunity may have dropped a bit by then, the risk will have plummeted further.
What do you say to the, and it sounds like a sort of fairly sick-form question to ask, but it is one that does crop up. I'm sure you see social media as well, Chris, when people say, look, you know, how long do we carry on with this booster thing? What, are we going to have one once a month for the rest of our lives?
Well, exactly right. I mean, at what point does the pill become worse than the ill? At the moment, it's very much a learning exercise, and we know that some people in society are more vulnerable. They're more vulnerable if they catch the infection. They're more vulnerable perhaps because even if they get vaccinated, they don't mount as robust an immune response as someone who's capable of mounting a good immune response to a vaccine. So there's a number of ways of looking at this. I think while we're learning and we're trying to take a cautious approach, you do these things on a cautionary basis, because that way you're not doing harm, but you are protecting people. Come the autumn, we'll have had a lot more time to measure what happens to people who are in these categories when they're boosted or not boosted, when they're infected or not infected. We can follow up and see what the immunity does. And we can begin to answer the question, well, actually, do we need to keep on boosting people? Do we need to boost everybody? Do we need to boost just a few? Probably, this is just my speculation, probably we're going to embrace this the way we do the flu. We know that the flu comes, sure as eggs, as a seasonal infection with a surge in the autumn and winter. And because it's predictable in that way, and we know who's most at risk, we can offer vaccines informed by what the world has been collecting and monitoring and has produced as the most likely candidates for the flu that season. We can produce tailor-made vaccines which will go into groups of people who we think are at greatest risk and protect them. And I strongly suspect that that will be the pattern in the near future on perhaps an annual basis for COVID. But given that most people have had 3 doses already, that might actually turn out to be well and truly enough to protect the average person from severe disease. We're going to catch it. People will catch it in the same way as people catch the flu, even though they've been vaccinated, but they don't become severely unwell thanks to the immunity conferred by the vaccine.
So what, I mean, it is a tale of, that there are many tales, and everyone has sort of anecdotal stories to tell. My kids just had it literally in the last week, quite lethargic on the first day. Running around like Tasmanian devils on the second day, i.e. back to normal. Friend of mine, three jabs, including the booster, had it pretty bad. He was, you know, like a bad dose of flu. Why would somebody who's been boosted 3 times get something so bad? And I'm not comparing him necessarily as an adult to kids who we know don't quite have the same levels of susceptibility or even serious illness as adults do. But why would anyone with 3 jabs have a bad case of COVID?
You've asked the million-dollar question and also pointed a finger at the biggest risk factor. Age does make a very big difference. Young people tend to fare much better than older people, but everybody's different. We all look different on the outside as a reflection on the fact that genetically we're all individuals and we're all different on the inside biochemically. And this means that some people's run-in with this virus is going to be very trivial, other people's very different. But one thing that may make a difference, and this has emerged in data generated this year from Imperial College, they asked the question, well, why is it that some people who live with someone who's got COVID, they just don't seem to catch it? Why do you not get 100% household transmission?
Well, it did. I mean, I'm an example of exactly that from this week, Chris.
Right. Well, their speculation, based on going and testing people in that very condition and that very situation, was that some people have had a run-in with other members of the coronavirus family, because this is a really big family of viruses. There are probably 5,000 different coronaviruses out there, only a handful of which routinely infect humans. But it turns out that they're similar enough that if you've had a run-in with some members of that family, you make a broad enough immune response that it actually recognises other members of the family and protects you against those too. Think back to Edward Jenner protecting people from smallpox by actually infecting them with cowpox, a related virus. It looks similar enough that you get some degree of protection from the real deal. And what they think is going on is that some people have actually had other related common cold type coronaviruses. That's produced quite a broad immune response in those people, and as a result of that, when they run into COVID, they either don't catch it or they catch it so trivially they don't actually know they've had it.
Yeah. And just a word, if you would, Chris, we just had this breaking news that in Scotland there are now more people in hospital who are positive than since the start of the pandemic. Of course, when I mentioned this on air 10 minutes ago, I did put the obvious caveat in. That doesn't mean to say they ended up in hospital because of COVID. They might just be someone who's got a bad leg and happened to test positive. But nonetheless, how troubling would a headline like that be, do you think?
It doesn't take very many cases of COVID to actually disrupt healthcare quite significantly because of the lengths we have to go to in order to safeguard other patients who aren't infected from those who are. Think about the situation with a car park where there are very few free car parking spaces. You end up with cars driving around all over the place and then having to do 50 million point turns to reverse a big vehicle into a tight parking place. We've all been in that position. We're running the NHS like a car park that's 99.9% packed full of cars with very, very few free parking spaces, and it really does become difficult to run a safe service that way. And this is certainly something for the government to think about. But you put your finger on it when you said the difference between the word because and with. There are lots of people in hospital at the moment with COVID. They're not there because of COVID. We think that number is probably 2/3 of the time people are in hospital with rather than because of COVID, because we've got very high levels of community transmission at the moment, maybe one person in 17 in Scotland. So in other words, just a busload of people is going to have at least one COVID person on it. People will continue to have heart attacks, strokes, fall over, break their leg and so on. They will end up in hospital, and a proportion of them will end up in hospital with COVID because they had it already or encountered it on the way in, not because they're sufficiently unwell. I've seen quite a few people in their 90s who've had COVID and didn't know it in my own hospital recently. So the vaccines are doing their job. They're stopping severe disease, but just cases still cause catastrophes in hospital because of the infection control measures we have to take to stop it spreading.
And just a very final point, a few people have got in touch on, Alison in particular says, you know, forgive me, but is this jab still under emergency use? Because there is some confusion there, and you'll be more aware than me, Chris. I'm sure you look at social media like the rest of us, and, you know, if you've got a spare 15 minutes and want to see what some people are thinking, you can see all sorts of theories about side effects and emergency use. What is the status of that? What is the deal with that?
Well, all drugs, all medicines, vaccines and no exception, have to go through a rigorous proceedings of clinical trials and then sign off by regulators to give them full formal approval. In some countries, some jurisdictions, they still are under emergency measures. Other countries have signed off on them completely. I don't know the status for the UK. I think we're still under current emergency legislation where they're partly underwritten by the government. But at the end of the day, billions of people have now had these vaccines around the world, and this is the biggest clinical trial that we've ever done. And at that scale of deployment, if we were going to see side effects, we would be seeing a huge number of them by now, and we're not. What we are seeing is very, very low rates of side effects, very, very high rates of protection. So certainly at this stage, we feel quite comfortable recommending the vaccines as a safe measure. So
is it fair to say then that because of the emergency nature, the unprecedented nature of what happened with COVID and the global spread of it, that it was, when the vaccines were rolled out, it was to an extent at least a trial?
In that respect, yes, although it's to be emphasised that no corners were cut, in the sense that when we normally do clinical trials, we do what's called phase 1 trials, where you just put the drugs into a small number of people who are healthy and you see, are there any side effects? Then you go into phase 2 trials where you actually try and see if you get any efficacy. If that seems to bear fruit, you then go into a very big phase 3 trials where you're asking, does this really work? And you do it in a blinded way, so you don't know if people have actually got the drug or got a placebo.
Yep.
What they've done is to line up all of those measures, and instead of having big gaps between them, they were able to, with real-time feeding back of data to the regulator, get through the process very, very rapidly indeed, in a very streamlined way, which meant that they got all the data, all the sign-off, all the reassurance that they needed, but they did it in double quick time.
Gotcha.
What we are still doing now is following up people to look at the longer term. How long do people get protected by these vaccines? Because we know they work in the short term, we know they stop severe disease, but the real learning is how long do they protect for in everybody, in just a few people, older, younger, different ethnic minority groups, etc. So there's a big learning process that happens over time, and as we don't have time machines, we can't speed that process up. We just have to keep on learning. But we have got lots of solid data on short term, how protective these vaccines are and how well tolerated they are, and that's what's informed the regulators saying they're okay to use.
And do we know what happened to AstraZeneca, by the way? Because that was a bit like travelling British Airways, wasn't it, AstraZeneca? You felt a sort of sense of patriotism. I had the AZ jab, and now it doesn't seem to even be there.
This was used in the initial deployment in the UK very, very heavily, in fact more heavily than most countries in Europe, which, because of the, I think, bad sentiment spread by Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel at the time, where they both expressed very negative views about it, it caused a lot of vaccine hesitancy in Europe. But then, for follow-up, when people began to do trials to say, well, if we want to use a booster vaccine, what is the best regimen to give us the most rapid response, the safest response, and the most robust antibody response in the shortest time, it emerged that the RNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, were used. Now, we had really high levels of initial vaccine uptake in this country, which meant that, obviously, if you're then going to go with what the evidence suggests is best for a booster, everybody's now going to get a Moderna or a Pfizer vaccine, which is why they're being used. Elsewhere in the world, the AstraZeneca vaccine continues to be used alongside the other. There are about 7 products now on the market that are being used, because when you need to get people vaccinated and immune as quickly as possible, it's whichever vaccines you can access as quickly as possible, which has got that track record, which AstraZeneca's vaccine has.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.